I'm the awarded for Kit Guru. This motherboard I'm reviewing today is the ASRock X370 Pro 4, you see, which is a brand new ATX design from ASRock. It's just going on sale here in the UK now. Pricing is due to be £105 including VAT, so relatively budget. It's ATX but slim ATX. Looks like a proper board. It's got a full list of features. You've got a whole bunch of USB on the I/O. You've got internal headers that support that. You've got 6 SATA. You've got a Type C on the I/O. You've got RGB headers. All good stuff. And then I stopped and I took a closer look and I thought this looks terribly familiar. And checking back through the Kit Guru archives, I came across the ASRock Fatality Gaming 4. Which to all intents and purposes is the same board. That obviously has the Fatality branding, this does not, but apart from that, whatever. And then I took a double extra closer look, and the VRMs, which are described as being 9 phase, so that's 6 plus 3 phase, they're actually not really quite that. The PWM controller, it has a sort of a doubling thing going on. It can do up to 4 phases. It can't do 6 phases for the CPU. So that is effectively 3 doubled, which is why you can see 6 lots of components. So 3 plus 3 for the SoC. And in the original review, the Fatality board did not overclock particularly well. It didn't do badly, it just wasn't particularly great. So a year down the road, the question is, does this Pro 4 and not Fatality board behave significantly differently to the Fatality, for better, for worse, or all the same? Is it really just a paint job, or what's going on? In terms of the features and such like, so we've got a bunch of USB, we've got a bunch of SATA, we've got the Type C as mentioned. We've also got integrated graphics taking up the I/O. That's going to become relevant later on. In the first instance, we're going to plug a Ryzen 7 in which case obviously we're working with this Vega 64 graphics card, but we're also going to give it a go with Raven Ridge, so we can actually try the next gen of Ryzen, the 2nd gen, because this board is AMD Ryzen Desktop 2000 ready. Sticker been added, which means the BIOS supports Raven Ridge out of the box. So that's the other half of this review. But as things stand, the question I want to address is the X370 Pro 4 the same as that Fatality Gaming K4, or are they actually different boards? So here we are in the Ufr Setup Screen, and if we move around, we can see, so there we have the main screen that's just reporting the hardware installed. Go to OC Tweaker. This function here is something of a puzzle. OC mode change switch ASRock setting is the default, and the alternative is to go to AMD CBS setting. I've asked ASRock about this. I got back an answer which really didn't tell me a lot other than telling me the two settings are ASRock and AMD. The default is ASRock. I've left it in ASRock. I've tried switching between the two and I'm really none the wiser what's going on with that. CPU frequency, so auto is where we're at. Change to manual mode. CPU frequency, so the base speed 3.4 at 1.35 volts. If we bump that up in 25 megahertz steps in the usual way, that is the granularity of Ryzen. Go to 3.9, enable XMP to get the memory up to the correct speed. There we go, so that's 3200. Voltage configuration. So we've set the CPU core voltage up top. 1.35 is obviously cautious, 1.4 is getting a bit more serious, 1.45 is heavy duty for Ryzen, 1.35 I'm happy about. But in voltage configuration, and we're not interested in DRAM voltage, that's covered by XMP, there's essentially nothing going on. If we go across out of OC Tweaker into advanced, we've got all the usual stuff, things like storage configuration and Southbridge. Tools consist of RGB, RAID and a UEFI update. We're on the latest BIOS. Hardware monitor tells us nothing we don't expect to see. We're in normal standard CPU fan mode. And that is your lot. So we save changes. So we've set the all-core CPU speed to 3.9 gigahertz. We've enabled XMP. That's it. In terms of fiddling around with SoC voltage and such like, options next to nothing. This is a really basic BIOS. It doesn't have any sort of preset overclocking profiles, anything like that. You can't just enable 4 gigahertz ASRock or some such and off you go. There's next to nothing to do in the BIOS apart from the and obviously XMP is necessary, but apart from that CPU clock speed, you could actually leave it quite easily on default speed, or you can go for a bit of extra speed. But done, we're in Windows, and let's just run Cinebench while we're here. And we're expecting a score around 1550 marks. Obviously all those cores pounding away is always going to give you a good score. Gives you a good score at stock speed, gives you a good score at overclock speed. Sorry, 1550 is the stock speed. Overclocked, I'm expecting 1700. $17.25, spot on the money. Absolutely happy. There you go. So 150, 170 extra marks in Cinebench on the overclock. And that pretty much is the end of the party tricks of this motherboard when you overclock. The Ryzen 7 1700X overclocked reasonably well. The motherboard did nothing too extraordinary. Clearly the VRMs are not the greatest, and 3.9 gigahertz was the highest stable overclock I could get without using ludicrous amounts of power, and I wasn't really up for that. With our second setup, we've switched over to the Ryzen 5 2400G, so that's a Raven Ridge with Vega graphics core, hence no graphics cards. We're connected directly to the I/O panel. When I reviewed Raven Ridge for launch, both the 2200G and 2400G, I was focusing naturally on the graphics. How well did the Vega graphics core in the CPU making it an APU work? And I was benchmarking games and such like at 720p and 1080p. I didn't actually pay a lot of attention to just what is the desktop like, the integrated PC powering a decent display experience, which is actually, when I think about it, really quite fundamental. Here we have a 28-inch Acer 4K display. It's got the usual inputs, Displayport, HDMI and DVI. And I'm connected here over HDMI because this motherboard doesn't have a DisplayPort output, so that's not an option for me. And you will note the scaling is not quite right. The icons are just off the edge of the screen, as you will have experienced doubtless if you've used HDMI in recent years. Generally speaking, you pop into the drivers and you enable scaling and you just change the settings slightly and all is good. This is an effect you actually get on televisions. You're just not aware of it because on TVs you don't have icons. The fact you lose a few mil off the edge of the screen just means you don't get a black border. So this overscanning, underscanning thing is entirely normal, but for Windows it's a problem. So you want it to be bang on, and generally you just drag back the scaling a fraction and everything's happy. With this motherboard, I couldn't do it. I had to do some research and I realized it's because at 4K you can't control scaling. But then I don't use HDMI at 4K generally. I use DisplayPort. Not an option here. And neither can I use DVI, which I haven't really used in anger in 5 years or so. Many years, many years. And forget about VGA, not interested in that. Both the VGA or D-sub and the DVI, they're actually limited to 1920 by 1200 resolution, so essentially 1080p plus a bit. 60 Hertz. If you're using 4K, if you're using cinematic 4K, so that's 4096 by 2160, you're limited to 24 Hertz. If you do regular PC 4K, that's 3840 by 2160, you're limited to 30 Hertz. So the refresh rate's no good, the scaling's no good, HDMI is essentially no good. You're obliged to drop your resolution down to 1080 to get a decent image, which means it's not going to be bang on pin sharp. So I'm just going to change the resolution in Windows to 1080. And having done that, back in the drivers, I'm going to scale the display correctly. And you will now see we have this HDMI scaling bar here, which is dead straightforward. So you just click along that and bump, and now we're happy. And as we go in further, we get a border appearing, which we don't want. So we just grab that and just pick the point at which we think that looks good. And just for the fun of it, now we've got the graphics set correctly, let's just run 3D Mark Firestrike just to once again demonstrate that the integrated Vega graphics are actually pretty good in terms of the grunt and the performance that they have. You might wonder why I'm running 3D Mark on a Raven Ridge APU on this ATX motherboard, and the surprising answer is this is actually at ASRock's request. ASRock wanted us to demonstrate that a second-gen Ryzen processor will run on this motherboard with the BIOS as it comes from the factory without any problems, and it clearly does. So in that sense, they got a result. But we said, well, hang on, you mean wait until the second-gen Ryzens come along? They're under NDA at the moment. They said, no. Use Raven Ridge because that is also second-gen, and you've got them, and you can run. Fair enough, we said it sounds crazy to us, but we'll do it. So here we are. And it's meant I've had to look again at the integrated graphics connections in this instance. The HDMI, which as you saw was a little bit of a struggle. You plug it in, it does not work out the box on a 4K display. You get a picture, but it's not right. You have to monkey around with the settings. If you're using a sub 4K display, if you're using 1080, it's no problem whatsoever, pin sharp, bang on, lovely. And that also works with DVI should you want to do that instead. But the 4K HDMI combo, not great. And it really makes me wonder why more motherboards don't have a DisplayPort. Personally, I'd love to see the end of VGA. I have no need for it, and also for DVI actually, it's redundant for me. DisplayPort and HDMI, that'll make me very happy indeed. The APU powers 3D Mark, but we know that. The Ryzen 7 1700X overclocked reasonably well, but it wasn't great. But then, are you really that stressed about the difference between 3.8 GHz, 3.9 GHz and 4.0 GHz? Probably not at the end of the day, but it is an absolute fact the VRMs on this board are not the finest quality. They support the processor reasonably well, certainly at stock clocks. Once you get to 8 cores and you start overclocking, you're into questionable territory, which is why, in my opinion, the BIOS is so basic. If you want to stick more voltage in, crank up the multiplier, it'll do it. Finesse, forget about it. The power system just isn't up to the job. And I suspect that's also why they haven't bothered with a profile, so you can, you know, say 4 gig or whatever, because I'm not entirely sure that it would behave itself. And we've finished there. As a motherboard, it's absolutely fine to a certain extent, but I am completely mystified why ASRock has issued what appears to be a new motherboard rather than just sticking with the existing Fatality. It appears to have gone up in price somewhat because the Fatality you can get for £85, and I simply do not see what you get with this £105 board that you don't get with the £85 Fatality. Also, in terms of running an APU on ATX board, that just makes no sense. I mean, mini ITX is perfect, micro ATX, okay, but smaller. The idea of running APU, full-size board, or well, it's a slim ATX, but nonetheless, APU on ATX, why would you do that? Makes absolutely no sense. So if you're interested in an X370 motherboard from ASRock that has a reasonable list of features, a decent amount of USB, has some USB 3.1 Gen 1 that looks like it might be Gen 2 but isn't, then go for the Fatality. It's the same board with some slightly prettier styling and it's cheaper. This board is a bit of a lame duck. The Fatality that we reviewed a year ago, it's the same hardware and that will do a perfectly decent job. If you like this video, thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. If you want more from Kit Guru, click to subscribe. Hit the bell button and you'll be notified as more videos become available from Kit Guru. I'm Leo Waldock and this is the ASRock X370 Pro 4.